Hey guys, tonight we're taking a strange and sleepy stroll through one of the weirder corners of Greek mythology, the one where Zeus turns into a goose, or maybe a swan, depending on which ancient poet hadn't had enough wine yet. You'll find yourself drifting through soft golden clouds over Mount Olympus, weaving past bickering gods, shape-shifting experiments, and the kind of mythological logic that would make your high school history teacher quietly weep. It's not a horror story. It's not even a proper romance. It's just mildly ridiculous in the most relaxing way possible, and believe me, by the end, you'll be wondering if you dreamt the whole thing or if you actually learned something historical about sacred eggs and divine poultry. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the winding path to Mount Olympus, the sky around you a dreamy shade of lavender gold. The wind carries the distant scent of wild thyme and lightning-scorched laurel, which, while poetic, is honestly not very pleasant. The mountain's uppermost cloud is humming softly. That's where the gods live, in a kind of eternal brunch that doubles as a cosmic HR meeting. You arrive just in time for a particularly unproductive debate. The gods are sitting around a large marble table, eating grapes without chewing and arguing about what counts as an acceptable mortal disguise. Hermes is halfway into a raccoon transformation and is being told very gently that no one in Bronze Age Greece knows what a raccoon is. Apollo is trying to pitch the idea of becoming a rainbow just for the weekend. And then there's Zeus, who is very much not paying attention. You can tell Zeus is bored. He has that look, that glint in his eye, that usually means someone's about to get turned into a shrub or impregnated by accident. And he does this thing with his beard, twisting it like he's winding up a bad idea. You've seen it before. Birds, he says suddenly. What if we all turned into birds? There's a pause. You could hear a myth drop. Athena adjusts her helmet, clearly concerned. Define bird. Zeus, with the air of someone about to regret nothing, replies, big, white, fluffy, maybe a goose, maybe a swan. We'll see what works. Now you need to understand something about the Olympians. They don't sleep, they don't age, and they definitely don't work a 9 to 5. So occasionally, just occasionally, they take on strange hobbies. Apollo once spent a decade pretending to be a shepherd. Artemis raised an orphan bear. Hera ran a surprisingly aggressive book club. And Zeus shapeshifts like a bored kid playing dress-up in a divine thrift store. He's already tried the classic forms bull, eagle, golden mist, even an ant once don't ask. But tonight, under the soft glimmer of ambrosial twilight, he's fixated on birds, a very specific kind of bird. One that glides effortlessly across lakes and looks majestic in ancient mosaics. The kind of bird that poets love and farmers dislike. Why a goose, you whisper to no one in particular. Behind you, Dionysus, who's just arrived with a wine jug and no pants, shrugs. Feathers are back in style, he says, then hiccups. It's not long before Zeus has vanished from the meeting entirely. You glance around, nothing but a few feathers caught in the updraft. And somewhere far below the mountain, a mortal girl is going about her evening, unaware that her life is about to become a myth that scholars will argue about for literally thousands of years. Back on Olympus, no one seems particularly alarmed by Zeus's disappearance. This is the third time this week. Hera sighs, peels a fig, and mutters something about, at least it's not a golden shower again. The table erupts into polite laughter and uncomfortable throat-clearing. Ari suggests a card game. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks really did attribute many natural phenomena and social customs to the whims of their gods. A thunderstorm wasn't just weather, it was Zeus making a point. A good harvest, Demeter's in a good mood. A goose that flies by in an unusual pattern. Clearly something dramatic is happening nearby. Myth was their way of organizing chaos with storytelling, and sometimes chaos got feathered. And here's your quirky tidbit. In ancient Greece, geese weren't just barnyard animals. They were guards, sacred animals. temple dwellers. There's even a record of geese saving Rome from a Gallic invasion, though granted that's a different empire. Still, they weren't seen as particularly romantic, which makes Zeus's choice unconventional. Historians still argue scholars say carefully whether the creature in the original myth was a swan or a goose. Some say it was definitely a swan based on older poetic traditions and vague descriptions. Others argue that later versions blurred the lines, possibly out of embarrassment or because birds are hard to draw. Either way, it seems even immortals can't make up their minds about basic zoology. You drift along the cloud edge listening to the gods bicker below. Someone just turned into a hummingbird. Hera's holding a vote. Apollo is playing a lyre solo no one asked for. And somewhere far beneath your feet, ripples spread across a still lake as Zeus flaps gently into myth. And really, this isn't even the weird part yet. You hover now just above the mortal realm, a cool twilight breeze drifting through the reeds of a still moonlit lake. The water below mirrors the sky, painted in shades of violet and soft cream, as if the gods themselves dipped their fingers in oil pastels and smudged the clouds to life. Somewhere beneath you, a figure begins to shimmer into existence, an oversized, elegant bird paddling gently toward the shore. Zeus apparently has committed. You squint. Is it a swan? A goose? Some kind of majestic waterfowl hybrid crafted by the divine equivalent of an indecisive doodler. His neck is too long. His feathers are too fluffy. His beady eyes gleam with way too much personality. You could argue either way. Frankly, so could the poets, and they often did, some insisting it was a noble swan, others muttering that it was obviously a goose, and the ancients were just being polite. But this bird, let's call it a goose for now, is not just floating for fun, it's scouting, watching, observing. From behind a low curtain of reeds, Zeus in goose form spots her. Leda. She's standing barefoot at the water's edge, the hem of her dress pulled slightly above her knees, gathering lilies. Not in some dramatic goddess-worshipping ceremony, but because her mother likes the way they smell when the house gets too smoky from the hearth. Her hair's braided loosely down her back, and she's humming something so old and soft that even the frogs nearby pause to listen. Leda doesn't notice the goose right away. To be fair, she's probably not expecting one to glide in like a mythical yacht. Zeus paddles closer, fluffing his feathers in what he clearly assumes is a seductive ripple. It isn't. You watch this whole encounter unfold with the resigned curiosity of someone observing a toddler about to commit to eating a rock. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. In Greek mythology, gods interacting with mortals, especially in disguise, was practically a genre. From Athena dressing as an old man to deliver strategic pep talks to Poseidon, disguising himself as a horse to woo Demeter. Yes, really, the idea of divine beings slipping into mortal forms was not just accepted, but expected. It was how gods manipulated fate, explored humanity, and well-started drama. The goose edges closer. Now the sources vary wildly about what happens next. Some claim Zeus charms Leda with the grace of 1,000 sunsets. Others suggest she runs and he gives chase. A few early versions perhaps wisely keep it vague, letting metaphor do the heavy lifting. What most agree on, however, is this: at some point during the encounter, Leda ends up cradling the bird in her arms, as if protecting it. And then somehow, she's pregnant. You'll be happy to know we are not here to dwell on the mechanics. Ancient myths prefer the surreal to the literal. You don't get logistics, you get imagery. You get eggs. But before we go, let's take a moment for a quirky tidbit. In some Roman interpretations of the myth, Zeus actually comes to Leda as two birds at once. One white, one dark. Scholars think this could symbolize the twins she would later bear, one divine, one mortal. Or maybe it's just the ancient version of hedging your bets. Either way, imagine trying to explain that to your local priest. Back on Olympus, there's silence. The kind that stretches. Hera has noticed Zeus's absence. She's tapping her nails on the arm of her ivory chair, a rhythm of mounting suspicion. She knows that look. She's seen that gleam. And she's familiar too, familiar with his bird phase. Meanwhile, Leda walks home as if nothing happened, save for the occasional dazed glance skyward. Perhaps she thinks it was a dream, or a spell, or maybe she's just trying not to think about it at all. Historians still argue whether the Leda story was meant to be literal, symbolic, or even satirical. One scholar wrote centuries later while sipping watered wine and probably reconsidering his thesis. Some interpretations view Leda as a metaphor for the fragility of mortal choices in the face of divine will. Others think it's just an old fertility myth wrapped in feathers and theatre. But you're here, floating gently beside the path as Leda returns to her quiet home in Sparta.
The moon rises fat and low, and the night air hums with the stillness that only comes before a legend truly begins. You can't help but notice the faint imprint of feathers trailing behind her in the dewy grass. In a few days, she'll find herself feeling strange. Not unwell exactly, just different. There will be whispers, a nervous glance from a midwife, and then one morning, tucked among the rushes near the hearth, she'll discover something utterly inexplicable.
But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, the goose has vanished. The gods resume their card game, and the story, bizarre as it is, glides onward on wings both real and symbolic. Sleepy, yet you're in the kitchen, now not yours, obviously, but Leda's. The hearth flickers quietly in the corner, casting golden shadows on the walls. The smell of warm barley porridge hangs in the air, and the stone floor is cool beneath your feet. The day is just beginning in ancient Sparta, and everything seems perfectly ordinary until it doesn't, because there in a woven basket stuffed with sheep's wool and straw is an egg. A big one. Not hen-sized, not even duck-sized. This thing is roughly the size of a helmet, with a pearly sheen and a kind of suspicious perfection to its curves. It glows faintly. Maybe it's the firelight. Maybe it's divine poultry magic. Leda stands there for a long time staring at it. Her husband, King Tyndareus, walks in half asleep, scratches his head and says, "Did one of the kitchen girls bring this in from the temple?" which is a very diplomatic way of saying, why is there a cursed god egg in our breakfast nook? And of course, Leda doesn't know. Or says she doesn't. Because what's she going to say? "Well, dear, I cuddled a suspiciously charming waterfowl, and now I think I'm about to hatch the future of Greek tragedy." That kind of thing just doesn't come up naturally in marital conversation. The egg sits there for 3 days. No one touches it, but no one throws it away either. That's the thing about divine objects, they carry an air of "don't mess with this unless you want to be a cautionary tale." And then one morning, it hatches. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Greek myth, Leda is said to have given birth to 2 eggs from which emerged 4 children. Clytemnestra and Castor generally considered mortal, and Hellene and Pollux generally divine. These offspring would go on to shape some of the most dramatic stories in ancient literature: the Trojan War, the saga of the House of Atreus, and the Dioscuri mythos, just to name a few. Their birth from eggs was never questioned, just accepted. You watch as the egg cracks gently, a faint golden light seeping from its seams. Leda covers her mouth in wonder, or maybe fear. Tyndareus steps backward, holding a ladle like it's a weapon. And then a baby. No 2. No 4. It's hard to tell at first because mythological math is fuzzy at best. Some versions say it was 1 egg, others say 2. But the point remains, children are here and they're not ordinary. One of them blinks up at Leda with the kind of calm, knowing gaze that suggests they've already read the Iliad in advance. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Ancient Greeks genuinely believed that some heroes were born from eggs. This wasn't limited to Leda. In certain versions of the Orphic tradition, even the universe itself hatched from a cosmic egg. Eggs were symbols of both mystery and divinity, something that held immense potential and broke open to reveal destiny. It's less omelette, more origin myth. Outside, the morning sun catches the tip of a bronze spear. A guard leans against a wall, entirely unaware that within the household behind him, the future Queen of Sparta and the eventual face that will launch 1,000 ships is drooling onto a wool blanket. Historians still argue whether the egg motif was a late addition to the Leda myth or part of an older Indo-European symbolism of cosmic birth, writes one slightly frazzled academic thumbing through dusty papyrus and muttering about narrative consistency. Some suggest it was adapted from Eastern traditions. Others think it's a metaphor for the womb. And a few brave souls simply throw their hands up and say, "It's mythology. Go with it." Later that day, a local priest visits the house. He peers at the now sleeping infant's boughs respectfully and announces that omens have been read and stars consulted. These children, he proclaims, are touched by the gods, which is the ancient Greek way of saying good luck with the future therapy bills. Leda nods politely. She doesn't mention the goose. You wander through the house as twilight falls again, noticing the subtle changes. People speak a little softer. They step more carefully near the crib. And above it all, the ever-present gaze of Olympus watches. Far above, Zeus lounges on a cloud with a smug expression and a slice of something ambrosial in hand. Hera glares at him from across the table, clearly putting two and two together. She doesn't say a word. But her next lightning-themed pottery class is going to be especially cathartic. Back in Sparta, Leda's life has already changed forever. She doesn't know what her children will become: legends, heroes, sources of endless bard songs and theatrical reenactments. But she does know this: things that come from eggs should never be underestimated. Neither should birds, apparently. The coals in the hearth crackle softly. The air is filled with the scent of lavender and baked figs, and somewhere in the rafters, a dove perches quietly watching. Or maybe it's a goose. Who knows anymore? The years pass soft as the wind drifting through linen curtains, and you find yourself wandering the halls of a Spartan palace that is slowly adjusting to being, well, slightly myth-infused. You drift beside Leda as she walks past the nursery where four very different personalities are beginning to take shape. Castor is already strong, quiet, and vaguely heroic, even when he's just stacking pebbles. Pollux, more of a daydreamer, his eyes always following birds in flight or shadows on the wall. Clytemnestra keeps stealing the wine cups and organizing the house staff with frightening efficiency. And Helen just glows. Not literally, not yet, but she has that sort of halo of attention around her. Even at the age of 5, everyone seems to pause when she enters a room. The house cats follow her. The wind seems to shift for her. And if you believe the myths, shepherds were already composing songs about her eyes, which is frankly a bit much. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In classical Greek tradition, Helen of Troy, later dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world, was considered divine in origin. Worshipped as a goddess in some regions of Greece, especially in Sparta, Helen had entire cults dedicated to her. Some viewed her less as a mortal woman, and more as an archetype beauty incarnate, a living idea rather than a historical person. You trail behind Helen and her siblings as they play along the garden paths where marble statues peek from behind olive trees and terracotta amphorae lean like sleepy sentinels. They race each other with uncoordinated glee, chasing shadows and inventing epic tales about monsters lurking behind hedges. And while most children pretend to be gods or heroes, these kids might actually become them. Pollux climbs a tree to prove he can see the sea. Castor tries to one-up him by wrestling a goat. Helen builds a throne out of cushions and makes Clytemnestra bring her grapes, which she does reluctantly. You're watching a myth in beta before the script tightens and the wars begin. Here's your quirky tidbit. According to one fringe variation of the myth, Helen was kidnapped not once, but twice before the Trojan War even started. One version tells of a Thessalian prince abducting her while she was still a child, which sounds like a security breach if you ask any Spartan royal guard worth their sandals. It's said that the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux rode out like twin hurricanes to bring her home, setting the stage for their lifelong roles as protectors. Which brings us to a gentle debate, still argued today. Historians still argue whether the tales of the Dioscuri are based on real warrior brothers, divine star gods, or dual-aspect folk spirits inherited from older Indo-European traditions. The twins were eventually immortalized as the Gemini constellation said to shine with eternal brotherly love. Whether that's literal or symbolic, it's all rather poetic for two lads who used to chase chickens around the breakfast courtyard. You pass by Leda again in the evening light. She looks older, a bit more worn, though there's a quiet strength in her posture now. She's learned to live with mystery, to stop asking why her children glow when they walk through sunbeams or why birds circle the roof whenever Helen sings. And what of Tyndareus? He does what most men in ancient myths do. When the divine meddles in their marriages, he carries on stoically focusing on statecraft and politely ignoring the divine feathers still occasionally found beneath the couch cushions. It's peaceful here for now, but Olympus never leaves its fingerprints quietly. Above, the gods are watching. Again. Zeus, feeling smug about his operation, goose egg hums to himself while inspecting constellations. Hera eyes the children with a storm-clouded squint. Apollo scribbles a few lines of prophecy about Helen on the back of a lyre chord sheet, and Ares, somewhere off in the corner, casually sharpens a spear. Because of course no myth this oddly domestic can stay quiet forever. But for now you listen to the gentle laughter of 4 myth-born children echoing through the columns and gardens of early Sparta. You watch as Helen curls up under a fig tree with her siblings, and Castor tells a story about a sea monster that steals sandals. Clytemnestra rolls her eyes. Pollux snores softly, his arm flung over a dog. The stars twinkle faintly above. The eggshells are long gone, but the strangeness remains wrapped in giggles and bedtime tales and olive oil-slicked hair. It's easy to forget at moments like these that this myth is only in its prologue. Time folds again like a well-worn cloak, and when you next open your eyes, you're walking beside a teenage Helen. She moves like someone who has never had to doubt the ground beneath her feet. There's a rhythm to it, graceful, unhurried, and with just a hint of theatrical flourish, like she knows the world will pause to accommodate her pace. And often it does. You follow her through the agora, the open market, where merchants shout over figs and fish, where bronze buckles glint in the sun, and philosophers hover near pillars trying to sell ideas nobody asked for. Helen barely glances at them. The crowd seems to part like a curtain for her, as if her presence is both familiar and too much. People stare, of course. Not just the average, oh, she's pretty kind of glance, but the kind of gaze usually reserved for eclipses and large predatory cats. She's a legend already, still living, still mortal, sort of, but undeniably shimmering with something that doesn't belong entirely to this earth. Your mainstream historical fact here is this: Helen's reputation for beauty wasn't merely poetic, it was political. Ancient Greek texts and plays often treated her as a symbol of civilizational fragility. Her abduction, or elopement, depending on who's telling the story, was the perfect narrative catalyst to justify massive war campaigns and shift the balance of Greek alliances. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was an excuse with great hair. One scholar referred to her as the blank canvas onto which every man projected his anxieties about control, temptation, and honor, which is a fancy way of saying everyone blamed her for everything. But right now, she's just a girl being watched too much, and it's exhausting. She ducks into a shaded alcove, brushes her fingers along a stone mosaic, and exhales. Clytemnestra joins her moments later, slightly sunburnt and unimpressed. 5 more proposals today, Helen mutters without looking up. Clytemnestra rolls her eyes. Were any of them conscious when they made it unclear? And here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions of Helen's youth, her suitors were so numerous and passionate that Tyndareus, her father, had to hold a royal competition just to keep the peace. The result was a sacred oath, the oath of Tyndareus, where all suitors pledged to defend Helen's chosen husband, no matter who he turned out to be. This oath would later drag nearly all of Greece into the Trojan War. So yes, ancient diplomacy basically boiled down to no takebacks on who gets the hot girl. Historians still argue whether this oath concept reflects a real historical precedent. Some murmuring scholar mumbles into their scroll. Was it a poetic invention to explain the improbable unity of the Greek kings, a reflection of ancient marriage diplomacy, or just mythology doing its usual thing, making messy relationships feel like matters of fate? Regardless, it worked. Helen eventually chooses or is given to Menelaus. He's a competent, rich Spartan, not necessarily passionate, but hey, he owns sandals in pairs and hasn't tried to compare her to a deer, so that's something. The wedding is a spectacle. Musicians, flute girls, enough oil lamps to accidentally summon a fire god. You drift through the banquet hall as nobles toast and laugh and lie politely to one another. Helen, radiant in a robe the colour of honey and fire, accepts it all with a practised smile. Pollux and Castor toast her with unwatered wine and questionable poetry. Clytemnestra wears a green dress and a scowl, possibly both borrowed. Even the local priests admit it feels too perfect. Because it is. Outside the palace beneath the moon, a stranger watches. Paris of Troy. Prince. Smooth talker. Terrible decision-maker. He's heard the songs. He's heard the prophecies. And thanks to a golden apple and a trio of vindictive goddesses, he's about to be a problem. But Helen doesn't know that yet. She dances once more before the evening ends, her robe fluttering like a story halfway through. A servant drops a goblet. Somewhere a dog barks at nothing. And you step away from the festivities and look up at the stars. Castor and Pollux, now Gemini, shine faintly above, already half immortalized. You wonder if they can see what's coming. You wonder if anyone really can. The air shifts. You know the kind of shift when a breeze carries tension instead of relief, when a room falls silent for no reason you can name. That's the atmosphere in Sparta just before Helen disappears. You drift through the palace early one morning. The servants are whispering. A sandal is found lying in the corridor. Her favorite scarf has vanished from the washing line. And in the harbour, a single ship has sailed away before dawn. Helen is gone. Menelaus wakes late. He's not exactly a morning guy, and learns the news over a breakfast he won't finish. His face collapses inward like a bronze statue melting in the sun. He doesn't rage. Not yet. First, he just blinks. Because how could this happen? Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Homer's Iliad, Helen is said to have either left willingly with Paris, charmed by Aphrodite, or been abducted under divine coercion. Ancient writers never quite agree. Some called her a seductress, others a pawn. The ambiguity itself is part of her mythic power. Helen is less a person than a prism, reflecting whatever lesson the storyteller wants to teach. In your case, you just float beside the shockwave her absence leaves behind. Pollux and Castor return to the palace at full gallop. Their horses snort and kick dust into the sky. Clytemnestra slams a door so hard that a fig bowl falls off the shelf. Tyndareus retires to the garden, clutching a laurel branch like it's a sod. The only one not surprised, maybe, is the court jester who mutters, "I knew it." No one that pretty stays local. Now for your quirky tidbit, some later sources claim Helen didn't even go to Troy. Yes, there's a whole alternate myth where Paris kidnaps a phantom Helen, a sort of divine clone, and takes her to Troy, while the real Helen hides out in Egypt for the entire war. That version pops up in Euripides' Helen, and it's a chaotic twist, even by Greek standards. It's like learning halfway through a movie that the main character was a hologram, and the real plot's been off-screen the whole time. But Menelaus doesn't know about phantom Helens or narrative variants. All he knows is his wife is gone, and everyone's looking at him like he should do something about it. So he invokes the oath of Tyndareus. Remember that little promise Helen's suitors made. It's time to cash it in. And suddenly, kings and warriors across Greece start packing their sandals and polishing their spears. Agamemnon shows up first, sword, gleaming beard immaculate. Odysseus arrives with one eyebrow raised and an already half-formed plan. Achilles struts in like he owns 3 sons. The war drums haven't started yet, but the wood is stacked, the oil's been poured, and all it needs is a spark. Historians still argue whether the Helen narrative was created after the fact to justify the unity of a disjointed Greek world, one might say. Was Helen a myth sewn to patch political wounds? A poetic stand-in for deeper grievances like trade pride or power? You glide over maps now following ships across the Aegean Sea. dozens of them with sails like thunderclouds and hulls that slice the water like blades. You follow them all the way to Troy, a city that until now has only existed in song and speculative geography. Troy stands proud on its hill. Gold-flared towers, intricate walls, and streets that buzz with activity. It's not just a battlefield to be. It's a real place full of bakers and weavers and tired shepherds with opinions about taxes. Inside Paris lounges like a man who doesn't quite understand what he's stolen. Helen sits nearby, wrapped in silks that smell of foreign spices. Her face is calm, but her eyes are calculating. She may be divine or mortal or something in between, but she knows what's coming. You drift beside her as she looks out the window at the sea. There's a pause in her breath, just long enough to let you imagine she might still run, that she might vanish again, vanish from the myth entirely. But she doesn't. Not yet. Back in Sparta, a storm breaks, not in the sky, in the hearts of men. The sails blot out the horizon like migrating birds with very sharp beaks. You hover above the fleet, so many ships it feels like the ocean has sprouted wooden teeth. The Greek kings, having united under one very questionable marital grievance, are now crossing the Aegean Sea with dreams of glory spoils, and possibly impressing the gods enough to avoid being turned into lizards. You float alongside Odysseus, whose ship carries more scrolls than swords. He's muttering formulas under his breath and questioning whether this whole expedition is just the world's most expensive midlife crisis. Achilles, meanwhile, sunbathes dramatically on his own vessel, halfway convinced he'll either become immortal or get bored trying. Mainstream historical fact here. While the Trojan War itself is considered mostly myth, the idea of a coalition of Greek forces attacking a fortified Anatolian city is loosely supported by archaeological digs at Hisarlik, often linked to Troy. Heinrich Schliemann, the 19th century archaeologist with a flair for drama and reckless excavation, found signs of fire and conflict in that region dated roughly to the 12th century BCE. So as with many myths, a real battle may have been the spark, if not the flame. The fleet stops oddly enough on the wrong shore. That's right, they accidentally invade the wrong city first, a place called Mysia. Oops. Here's your quirky tidbit. In their rush to wage war, the Greeks land at a random coastal town, mistake it for Troy, burn half of it, and only realize much later that they've declared war on a completely unrelated group. Imagine launching a massive expedition to rescue a princess and accidentally torching a vacation village instead. Paris, meanwhile, is still in Troy, composing love poems and twirling his hair. And Helen Yu find her in a sun-drenched courtyard, trying not to laugh at a handmaiden's impersonation of Menelaus. She's aware dimly of the armies converging on her location. But her world is quiet for now. A peach tree drops blossoms into her lap like tiny pink warnings. She doesn't brush them away. As you drift over the walls of Troy, you catch glimpses of everyday life continuing almost in denial. Children play knucklebones in alleyways. Bakers curse at sticky dough. Old men sit under porticos arguing about whether the gods favor roasted or raw offerings. And still the ships come. The Greeks regroup, realign, and finally land at the right place. Historians still argue whether Troy was truly a centralized power or more a collection of wealthy trade outposts. One weary academic mutters from the footnotes. Its location close to key trade routes made it valuable. But was it really worth a decade of war and a body count you can see from space? No matter. The war begins not with a roar, but a splatter. Arrows hum like angry bees. Spears clatter off shields. The battle scenes are chaotic, unchoreographed, like toddlers playing with kitchen knives. And still the siege doesn't break Troy. Its walls are legendary. Built, they say, by Poseidon himself. That kind of architecture doesn't crumble easily unless you bring a horse, but we're not there yet. You wander among the Greek tents at night. Fires flicker, soldiers snore, and bards sing dirges that sound like lullabies sung by drunk owls. The air smells of oil, sweat, and ambition. You pass Agamemnon's tent, where he's scowling over a map, flexing his jaw like he's trying to intimidate the parchment. And Achilles is sulking. See, Agamemnon took his prizewoman Briseis, and now Achilles refuses to fight. A pivotal tantrum in the Iliad, and a fine example of divine-level pettiness. You find him lying on a bearskin rug, composing bitter haiku and waiting for the Greeks to realize how much they miss him. The war stalls. Helen, from her high tower, watches the siege unfold. At times she closes her eyes and hums songs from Sparta. At others she names each Greek general from memory, sometimes incorrectly, just to irritate Paris. She feels the weight of being watched by God's men, history itself, and wears it like a second robe. You wonder if she regrets leaving. But she's Helen. Regret isn't in her vocabulary, only reinterpretation. Outside the city, the bodies pile. Not dramatically, just one by one, like falling leaves. The wind carries prayers and curses alike, and in the shadows something slithers closer. Not a creature, an idea, a wooden one, but we'll get there. You wake to thunder, but it's not from the sky. It's the ground trembling under the weight of bronze and rage. The war is no longer a chapter. It's a loop repeating every morning. Clang, shout, run, fall. Spears break swords, dull men age a year every week. And still the walls of Troy hold. Achilles is still refusing to fight. You glide through the Greek camp where tension crackles louder than the campfires. Odysseus tries talking sense into Achilles. Nestor offers speeches so long they could put a cyclops to sleep. Diomedes just keeps sharpening his sword, muttering about how the guy with the sulk is ruining the vibe. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Iliad isn't about the whole war. It covers just a few weeks in the final year, zooming in on Achilles' withdrawal from battle and its consequences. It's less about strategy, more about bruised egos and divine meddling, basically a very old workplace drama with extra stabbing. Now, your quirky tidbit. During this pause in fighting, the Greeks invent new games to kill time: foot races, javelin contests, even discus throws. The Olympics were still centuries off, but this might be their mythic origin story, a bunch of bored soldiers trying not to strangle each other during a 10-year camping trip. Inside Troy, Helen watches. She spends more time alone now. Paris still adores her, but the weight of the war begins to shadow their relationship. He buys her gifts, silks, perfumes, a tiny singing bird, but she barely looks at them. He writes her poems with too many metaphors, and she edits them with a blunt quill. She's polite, distant, watching the coastline with the quiet intensity of someone calculating the length of each wave. One evening, Priam, the king of Troy, invites her to stand on the city walls beside him. He's old but kind, like a fading constellation, still holding its place in the sky. Together they watch the battlefield. Priam asks, "Can you name the men down there?" She does. Everyone. And when he asks if she wishes she'd chosen differently, she replies not with words, but with a silence so heavy it swallows the sun for a moment. You linger beside her as night falls. She breathes in the sea air like it might remind her who she was. And somewhere far away, a messenger from the gods delivers a dream to Agamemnon, whispering strategies that sound suspiciously like gambling tips. Meanwhile, Achilles' best friend Patroclus has had enough. He sees Greek warriors falling, daily morale breaking like dry twigs, and decides to act. He borrows Achilles' armor, gleaming divine forged, and rides into battle pretending to be the hero everyone misses. And for a moment, it works. The Trojans falter. Morale shifts. The Greeks rally behind what they think is Achilles. But Hector, Prince of Troy, and arguably the most honorable man in this entire myth, confronts the Golden Warrior. They clash, and Patroclus falls. Not just dies, falls, as in changes the axis of everything. Achilles breaks. You drift beside him in his tent, where he holds Patroclus's lifeless body, and howls a sound that doesn't belong in this world. It's a roar that splits the night, wakes the gods and makes nearby soldiers cry without knowing why. Historians still argue whether Patroclus and Achilles were lovers or simply the closest of companions, one murmurs softly. But myth doesn't require certainty, only impact, and Patroclus's death is a meteor silent in space until it slams into the earth. Achilles returns to battle. He dons new armor forged by Hephaestus himself, a set that gleams like bottled starlight and carries every ounce of vengeance he now breathes. He doesn't speak. He doesn't hesitate. And when he meets Hector on the field, well, you already know that moment's coming. It doesn't need music. It doesn't need narration. It just happens. And after Helen stands alone on the walls again, watching the dust settle, she says nothing. But if you listened closely, you might hear her whisper something ancient and brittle. I never asked for any of this. Hector's body drags behind Achilles' chariot like a shadow that refuses to stay buried. You follow from above, wincing each time the wheels thump over a rock or ridge. Achilles is not himself, or perhaps he's more himself than ever. His grief has devoured his reason, leaving only ritual humiliation in its place. Day after day he drags Hector's corpse around the walls of Troy, daring the Trojans to come out and stop him. No one does. Inside the city, Troy mourns not just for Hector, but for the last sliver of dignity in this war. Hector was their pillar, brave, rational, devoted. A warrior who didn't fight for pride or prizes, but for his family and his city. His death unravels them in quiet ways. Fewer smiles in the market, more empty seats at supper. A persistent silence even the liars can't break. And Helen. She cries. Not performatively, not dramatically. Just quietly in a corridor of cool stone. She had liked Hector. He had treated her like a person rather than a prize. She places a fresh-cut flower on the altar and walks away before anyone sees. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the Homeric tradition, burial rites were essential to honor and peace. To deny someone proper burial was one of the gravest offenses. Achilles knew this, of course. That's why he did it. But now enters Priam. The old king cloak trembling and sandals worn sneaks into the Greek camp under cover of night. He kneels before the very man who killed his son, not with bitterness, but with open hands. He kisses those hands too, those blood-soaked knuckles, and begs for Hector's body back. You're there in that tent as Achilles' rage begins to thaw. It's not a sudden forgiveness, more like a crack in a frozen river. He looks at Priam and sees his own father. He sees what grief looks like when it walks upright. And surprisingly, touchingly, he weeps. He returns Hector's body. This single act becomes the mythic blueprint for empathy. Two enemies mourning the same loss, the same futility. For one breath in a decade of blood, the war pauses. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions, Hermes himself escorts Priam to and from the camp, invisibly guiding him past bloodthirsty guards, like a divine Uber driver with an unusually high rating. The Trojans bury Hector with full honors. You float above the funeral pyre as flames curl into the stars and mourners chant songs older than writing. The city holds its breath, unsure of what comes next. Meanwhile, back in the Greek camp, Achilles fades. Not physically yet, but spiritually. He's fulfilled his rage, but it hasn't healed him. He's like a sword without a purpose. The gods whisper of his fate, and he starts hearing echoes in the wind that weren't there before. Historians still argue whether Achilles' death was meant to symbolize the end of an age, murmurs a scholar from somewhere between the lines. The Iliad doesn't actually tell of his death, but later myths pick it up like a baton in a relay. And it's Paris, of all people, who fires the arrow. With help from Apollo, the god of sun truth, and apparently petty vengeance, the arrow finds Achilles' only vulnerable spot, his heel. That one soft sliver the river Styx never kissed. You see him fall. Not like a hero in slow motion, but like a man whose story has reached its final punctuation. He dies surrounded by silence. The Greeks mourn differently this time. They don't scream. They don't threaten. They just go still. Achilles had been their fury, their rallying point, their unofficial deity. Without him, the war feels like an echo chamber. Odysseus, ever the planner, steps forward. He begins whispering about a new idea, one involving carpentry, something equine. But that's still a few sleepless nights away. First, a bit of chaos. Achilles' armor must now be passed on. Ajax the Great believes it should be his. After all, he retrieved the body. He fought valiantly. He's basically a walking tower. But Odysseus speaks better, and in Greek, myth rhetoric often wins over muscle. Odysseus gets the armor, and Ajax, well, he breaks. In one of mythology's most tragic footnotes, Ajax falls into madness, slaughters a field of livestock, thinking they're his enemies, then realizes the truth and takes his own life. A reminder that the war destroys not just bodies, but minds. Helen watches the stars that night, wondering how many names they still remember. She no longer bothers trying to sleep. The dreams are always louder than the war. It's been 10 years. The sea air tastes stale now. Even the campfires burn slower, as though they too are tired of this endless siege. But tonight, there's movement not on the battlefield, but in the shipyards. You glide through the Greek camp as whispers flit from tent to tent. Odysseus has a plan. A real one. Not a pep talk, not a moody prophecy, but a tangible wooden hollow plan. A horse. Not just any horse, this one stands taller than the gates of Troy, carved from the hulls of war-worn ships, its belly roomy enough for 30 warriors, and one particularly nervous archer with a bladder issue. The Greeks say it's a gift, a tribute, a thanks for the memory's parting gesture. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The story of the Trojan horse isn't actually in the Iliad. It appears in later works like Virgil's Aeneid. But over time it became the most iconic chapter of the war, ironic, considering it wasn't part of the original playlist. Your quirky tidbit. The term Trojan horse is now used in cybersecurity to describe hidden malware that sneaks in under the guise of something useful, meaning that Odysseus accidentally invented phishing scams centuries before email existed. Congratulations, King of Ithaca. As the horse rolls toward the gates, the Trojans stare at it, with the kind of wary confusion you might reserve for a surprise gift from an ex. The walls of Troy are high, its people proud, and the gift, well, it doesn't look cursed. A man named Laocoon steps forward, a priest. Wise, cautious, very read the terms and conditions energy. He shouts, "Beware, Greeks, bearing gifts," a phrase that will echo through centuries. And just in case that wasn't clear enough, he hurls a spear at the horse. The wood thuds, no sound from within. Then, just to spice things up, the gods send sea serpents. Because why not two massive, writhing creatures slither from the surf and strangle Laocoon and his sons right in front of everyone? The Trojans, ever skilled in divine logic, decide that the gods clearly want them to accept the horse. So they wheel it in. You drift beside them as they pull the beast through the gates, unaware that every clunk of the wheels is a countdown. Children toss flowers, women sing, a makeshift feast begins. Even Helen smiles, though it doesn't reach her eyes. Inside the horse, 30 warriors hold their breath. Odysseus clenches his dagger. One soldier sneezes. Another quietly considers converting to farming. Historians still argue whether the Trojan horse was literal, symbolic, or even just a misinterpreted siege machine someone murmurs in the back of your mind. But myth doesn't require blueprints. It requires belief. That night, Troy celebrates. Fires burn, high wine flows like rivers, and for the first time in years, people dance. Helen walks among them, silent like a ghost, too polite to interrupt. Then, after midnight, the belly of the horse cracks open. The Greeks pour out like shadows moving fast, silent, practiced. They rush to open the gates. The rest of the Greek army, hidden on nearby islands, pretending to sail away, returns under moonlight. Troy never stood a chance. You float above the chaos, and it is chaos, not the glorious kind, but the cold, efficient kind. The kind that doesn't scream, it whispers. Blades glide, flames leap, screams pierce and fade. No heroics, just an ending. Helen's palace is set ablaze. Men rush through her halls searching for her, but when they find her, she is still, unmoving, almost serene. Paris is gone, struck down earlier that night by an arrow meant for someone else. He died looking confused, a fitting punctuation mark for a man whose choices rewrote the sky. And Helen, She returns to Menelaus. Yes, really. He finds her amidst the ruins, and depending on which version you believe, either lifts his sword or drops it. She says nothing. He lowers his blade, and together they walk out of the city through ash and memory. Odysseus stands by the burning gates, watching the dawn like someone who already regrets tomorrow. The war is over, but you floating, blinking quiet, you sense that the gods aren't finished. They never really are. You hover above the still smoking ruins of Troy, where the sun rises slowly, as if it too doesn't want to see what's left. The war is done, but peace hasn't returned. There's no cheering, no triumphant music. Just looters, moving like shadows, the sound of cracked pottery underfoot, and the soft hiss of cooling stone. The Greeks wander the wreckage like sleepwalkers. Some try to make sense of it, but there's no sense left to make. Victory feels suspiciously like loss in a different costume. The gods got their entertainment. The humans, well, they got ghosts. Odysseus lingers longest scanning the burning skyline, as if waiting for something to tell him it's time to go. He doesn't know it yet, but his voyage home will be a decade-long maze of shipwrecks, sea monsters, witch islands, and existential side quests. You'll follow him eventually, but tonight you're still here. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The fall of Troy likely echoes a real destruction event during the collapse of the Late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE, when several major civilizations experienced widespread ruin. Trade collapsed, cities burned, and writing systems disappeared for centuries. Now here's a fringe tidbit. Some fringe scholars believe that the real Trojan horse could have been a misunderstood siege technique like an earthquake machine or a literal battering ram shaped like a horse head. Others wonder if it was code for bribery or sabotage. The horse may have had less to do with carpentry and more with creative metaphors. Either way, the Trojans fell for it. As the Greeks pack up their camps and prepare to sail home, the gods watch from Olympus, smug and satisfied. Except Hera. She still isn't thrilled about that whole Apple of Discord situation. Aphrodite smirks every time she thinks of it, fanning herself with a peacock feather. Zeus. He chuckles and leans back quietly, congratulating himself for orchestrating a decade-long blood opera using nothing but beauty contests, family trauma, and bad dreams. Classic Zeus. Oh, and Poseidon. He's just getting started, because the gods don't like endings. And so they begin again. You glide to the beach where a man named Aeneas limps through ash and blood, leading a small band of survivors. He carries his father on his back and holds his son's hand. He doesn't look heroic. He looks tired. But this historians say is the beginning of something new. Historians still argue whether Aeneas was a Trojan patriot or a Roman propaganda tool someone whispers in your ear. Virgil's Aeneid, written centuries later, will claim that Aeneas fled Troy to eventually found Rome, that he carried the soul of Troy across the sea to seed a new empire. Is it true, maybe? Or maybe it's just a good story told well. Helen stands alone now somewhere near the ships. Her face is calm, unreadable. In some stories, she sails quietly back to Sparta, slipping into her old role like a coat that no longer fits. In others, she's punished or even exiled. And in one strange myth, she never even went to Troy at all. It was a phantom version of her, a mirage. The real Helen was in Egypt the whole time, sipping date wine and wondering why everything felt too quiet. The myths contradict Leia and contradict again, like dreams half remembered after waking. And you finally float away from Troy, your view rising higher until the burned walls blur into distant embers, and the sea glitters with ships full of men who have won nothing but the chance to go home. They don't know it yet, but most of them never will. You drift over one ship in particular, a lean black-sailed vessel where a tired man named Menelaus sits beside Helen. They don't speak. They just look out at the waves, waiting for the wind to return. You watch them sail into the horizon, silhouettes against the red morning. The war is over, but the myth is just beginning. Now that Troy lies behind you, the sea becomes your new stage. You drift gently over the open Aegean, where ships bob like forgotten toys. The waves murmur secrets, and the sky stretches wide and patient as though it's seen all this before, and it has. Beneath you, Odysseus's ship slices through the water. His men are already dreaming of hearth fires and roast goat and wives who haven't seen them in 10 years. But Odysseus stares forward, brow furrowed. He knows the gods too well to trust calm seas. And he's right. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient seafarers, including the Greeks, used constellations like Orion and the Pleiades to navigate. They didn't have compasses, only the stars, the sun, and their memory of coastlines. Now, here's your fringe tidbit. Some scholars speculate that Homer's Odyssey is less a single tale than a stitched-together travel guide, possibly based on real sailors' oral accounts of island hopping gone wrong. As you float above the ship, you sense the tension. The winds shift. The sails snap. A murky shadow stirs beneath the waves. Enter Poseidon. Remember him. Sea god. Earthshaker. Ocean dad with serious anger issues. He's still seething over Odysseus, stabbing out his son Polyphemus's eye, you know, the giant Cyclops, who made poor life choices about hospitality. And so begins the detour of all detours. Storms strike without warning. One moment, the crew's eating dried figs, the next, they're hanging onto ropes, soaked and swearing. They're swept past familiar landmarks and flung toward strange shores. You land on one, the island of the Lotus Eaters. At first glance, it's a tropical paradise, lush, lazy, full of oddly smiley locals offering snacks. But the lotus flowers are narcotic. One bite, and you forget your name, your mission, even how annoyed you were about dinner rations. Odysseus has to physically drag his men back to the ship like a sleep-deprived parent pulling toddlers from a trampoline park. From there, it only gets weirder. They next land in a cave stocked with cheese, never a good sign. You remember this one? Polyphemus the Cyclops lives here. He eats a couple of crew members, tries to save the rest for leftovers, and gets a flaming stake to the eye for his trouble. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops' tale is based on encounters with ancient elephants' skulls, someone whispers. The large nasal cavity could have been mistaken for a single eye socket. It's an oddly comforting idea until you remember the cheese. Odysseus escapes by tying his men to the undersides of sheep. Yes, really. You float along as they bob out of the cave, sheep, bleating men, sneezing, and Odysseus, because he cannot resist, yells back to Polyphemus just before they reach the sea. Classic Odysseus, smart enough to escape a monster, not smart enough to keep quiet about it. Polyphemus screams to his father Poseidon, and the sea god adds a few extra detours to Odysseus's itinerary. Next stop, Aeolus, king of winds. This guy's friendly enough to give Odysseus a literal bag of wind, all the winds tied up neatly like a mythological gift basket. Odysseus warns his crew not to touch it. Naturally, the second he naps, they open it, thinking it's treasure, and the winds toss them all the way back to where they started. You feel the weight of their groans from above. Another island, another lesson. They find Circe next to Sorceress, who turns men into pigs, which, depending on your point of view, is either an insult or an accurate metaphor for how the crew's been behaving. Odysseus resists her spell with help from Hermes, and eventually Circe warms to him. She even helps him plan the next leg of his journey, which includes a cheerful visit to the underworld, but that's for later. For now, you drift with the ship once more rocked by gentle waves, listening to the snoring sailors and the quiet creak of wood. The stars twinkle above, utterly unmoved by everything, and somewhere beneath Poseidon stirs again. The sea has no straight lines. Neither does this story. You're floating now over the edge of something darker, deeper, a place where even the gods speak in whispers. Odysseus, ever the curious overachiever, has reached the shores of the underworld. Circe had told him it was necessary to seek advice from the dead, like you do when you've run out of maps and morale. And so here you are, watching the crew build a trench and pour libations of honey milk wine and the blood of a freshly slaughtered sheep. Not exactly a beach picnic. From the shadows come the souls. They flicker like candle smoke, insubstantial, but still bound by memory. Odysseus speaks to many famous and forgotten. He sees his old crewmate Elpenor, who died stupidly by falling off a roof while drunk. Elpenor politely requests a proper burial. It's a bit awkward. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greeks believed the dead wandered unless given proper funeral rites. Burial customs were a civic and spiritual duty, often involving coins on the eyes to pay Saturn, the boatman of the dead, and the fringe tidbit. Some modern scholars believe these underworld episodes may reflect ancient Near Eastern influences, specifically rituals found in Mesopotamian or Hittite traditions that also emphasized communicating with ancestors through blood offerings. Odysseus then sees the ghost of Tiresias, the blind prophet. Tiresias gives him vague but ominous advice. Basically, avoid the cattle of the sun. God, don't trust the gods too much, and maybe try humility. And then because the underworld is a bit of a who's who gala, Odysseus runs into his mother. He didn't know she'd died. She tells him about Ithaca, about Penelope, about the suitors who've taken over his house. It hits hard. He tries to embrace her, but she slips through his fingers like mist. Historians still argue whether this scene reflects actual funerary beliefs or is purely poetic metaphor someone murmurs near your ear. The tension between grief and futility, the idea that even the dead can't offer true closure, is deeply human. You drift alongside the ghost parade as Achilles appears towering and quiet. Odysseus flatters him, calling him the greatest hero. But Achilles just shrugs. I'd rather be a living servant than a dead king. Yikes. That one lingers. When Odysseus finally sails away from the land of the dead, you feel the weight leave the ship. The men are silent, shaken like tourists returning from a very intense museum tour. But there's no time for rest. The sea never waits. They next encounter the sirens, those mythical temptresses whose songs lure sailors to shipwreck. Odysseus, clever as ever, plugs his men's ears with wax and has himself tied to the mast. You float above as they row past jagged rocks, his body straining against the rope's face, twisted in agony and longing. The song, you don't hear it, but it's said to promise knowledge, secrets, flattery, anything you want, really. Whatever would make you forget yourself and dive into the deep. Odysseus survives. Barely. Then comes Scylla and Charybdis, the six-headed sea beast, and the monstrous whirlpool. It's a literal lose-lose situation, and he chooses Scylla, sacrificing 6 men rather than everyone. From your aerial view, it's all frantic splashing, screaming and flailing arms, and then silence again. The ship, now half empty and haunted, limps on toward the next divine trap. It's exhausting, isn't it? This endless loop of myth, memory, and misjudgment. But that's the thing about Greek myths. They rarely offer resolution. Only repetition and reflection. You drift above Odysseus, staring at the stars, wondering why every answer leads to another riddle. He's tired. So are you. But Poseidon isn't done yet. You wake to waves licking a narrow shore and gulls crying above your head like old men grumbling over coffee. The ship has docked on the island of the sun Thrinacia, if you're feeling poetic. Odysseus knows this place is cursed. He was told by Circe, by Tiresias, by his own sense of narrative tension, not to let his crew touch the cattle here. The sun god Helios owns them. They are sacred, untouchable, not even for a nibble. So naturally, the crew touches them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many ancient Mediterranean cultures, livestock were considered sacred property of deities, and harming them could result in serious social and religious consequences, especially in Homeric societies that believed strongly in divine retribution. The quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories suggest that the cattle of the sun might have been symbolic representations of solar cycles or planetary bodies, and the taboo reflects a mythic warning about disrupting cosmic balance. Back to the story. You float above as the crew, stranded by a windless calm, grows hungrier and hungrier. Their supplies run low. There's only so much dried fish and barley porridge a person can take. And while Odysseus is off praying or possibly napping under a tree, his men cook up a scheme and the cattle. They roast the forbidden beef. Helios, being omniscient and deeply offended, storms over to Zeus and demands justice. If you don't punish them, he threatens, I'll take the sun and move it to the underworld. It's one of mythology's most passive-aggressive power plays. Zeus obliges. As soon as they set sail again, a storm crackles into being. The sky splits open. Lightning strikes. The ship shatters like pottery in an earthquake. Everyone dies, except Odysseus. He clings to a broken timber tossed like seaweed across the wine-dark waters. Days blur into nights. He washes ashore, half-drowned, half-crazed on the island of Ogygia. Welcome to the spa of Calypso. She's a nymph, immortal, gorgeous, owns several singing birds and tasteful driftwood furniture. She nurses Odysseus back to health and promptly falls in love with him. For 7 years. Here's the part where time gets soft, where your dreams overlap with his. You float with Odysseus through long afternoons of fruit and honey and ambivalence. Calypso offers him immortality. He declines. He misses Ithaca Penelope, the thrill of surviving things. Historians still argue whether Calypso represents an older pre-Greek goddess tradition, perhaps linked to fertility cults or the cycles of vegetation whispers someone in your ear. But Odysseus, he just wants to leave. Eventually, the gods intervene. Hermes arrives with a divine breakup letter, and Calypso reluctantly lets him go. He builds a raft, drifts once more, and because the gods are nothing if not predictable, Poseidon spots him again and hurls yet another storm at his head. But this time Odysseus is saved by a sea nymph, Ino, who gives him a magical veil. He reaches shore again, this time the land of the Phaeacians. They take him in, feed him, clothe him, ask him to tell his story. And so, for the first time, Odysseus speaks. He recounts it all, the wars, the monsters, the bad decisions, the bits with the pigs and the ghosts and the beef. You float above the firelight, watching the rapt faces of his hosts as he weaves his tale. It's a story within a story, a memory folded into myth. The Phaeacians, moved by his honesty and possibly afraid of cosmic retaliation, offer him a ship to finally go home. And you follow through the foam and spray toward Ithaca. It's close now. You can feel it. At long last, you see Ithaca. Not the glowing, idealized memory Odysseus clung to through tempests and trials, but the real one. Rocky cliffs, weathered olive trees, and goats that look faintly judgmental. It smells like rosemary and sea salt and home if you've been gone 20 years. Odysseus doesn't arrive with trumpets. The Phaeacians drop him off while he's still asleep. Classic. He wakes in the sand, confused. It's the cruelest trick of all. Home, but unfamiliar. The land feels distant, like returning to a childhood bedroom and realizing someone else painted over your glow-in-the-dark stars. Athena appears, of course. She loves a good disguise and a dramatic entrance. After a bit of banter, she confirms the truth: this is Ithaca. But things have changed. Penelope is still holding on. Barely. The palace is overrun with suitors, dozens of obnoxious, entitled men who assume Odysseus is dead and his wife is up for grabs. They feast on his food, sleep in his linens, and write bad poetry. Your mainstream historical fact, ancient Greek hospitality, or xenia, was a sacred custom. To abuse it, as the suitors do, was more than rude. It was a violation of divine law and often punished by the gods themselves. The quirky bit. Some scholars think Penelope might have been subtly manipulating the suitors all along, not just weaving and unweaving that infamous shroud, but deliberately delaying, distracting, and outsmarting them. Ancient passive resistance 101. Athena disguises Odysseus as a ragged beggar. He limps into his own home unrecognized, testing everyone's loyalty. His old dog Argos sees through the disguise immediately and promptly dies of joy. You tear up a little. Even gods can't make dogs live longer. Inside the palace, Penelope still grieves. She tells the beggar, who she doesn't know is her husband, that she'll marry whoever can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow clean through 12 axe heads. A party trick that's more assassination audition than wedding contest. None of the suitors can even string the bow. Then Odysseus, still in rags, steps up, strings it effortlessly, shoots the arrow. Bullseye. And then with help from his son Telemachus and a very locked door, he begins the quiet, brutal task of reclaiming his home. You float above the scene. There's tension, but not chaos. Athena slows the time like thick honey. The suitors fall one by one, not in gore-soaked frenzy, but in the cold arithmetic of mythic justice. When it's done, Penelope tests him one last time. She tells a servant to move their bed. Odysseus flinches, it can't be moved. He built it from a living olive tree rooted in the earth. Only he would know that. Penelope smiles. He's home. Historians still argue whether the Odyssey ends with peace or ambiguity. Some versions have angry suitor relatives stirring rebellion. Others end in tranquility. But here tonight, let's choose rest. And now the wind down begins. You're back in your own bed, or maybe drifting through ancient orchards, the scent of time heavy in the air. The gods have gone quiet. The sea, at last, is still. Olive branches rustle gently overhead. Somewhere nearby, a loom creaks softly as Penelope weaves in the dark. A dog sighs in his sleep. A bough lies quiet on its stand, unstrung. Everything that needed to happen has happened. Odysseus sleeps at last, and so should you. Let your limbs sink deeper into the mattress. Let your breathing fall in time with the waves. Each breath a tide, each exhale a homecoming. You've wandered far tonight, but you're back now. Sweet dreams.